Right. Looks like a couple of people are still having lunch or having an after lunch dip. I don't know. We'll see who comes in. So welcome. First of all, maybe someone doesn't know me yet. I'm Danny Verkade, founder and CTO of Cream. Cream is a digital Magento agency based in the Netherlands, and we're a company of 15 in total. Our clients are mostly located in the Netherlands and Europe. However, we've also done work for US clients, mainly stadium goods, help them migrate from M1 to M2, and dual scale as well, migration, Magento 1 to M2. I have experience with Magento since 2009, which is like a long, long time. And I'm a past member of the Magento Association board. And I'm doing this talk on behalf of this role that I had as a board member. So first, to set some context, my LinkedIn is really all about Shopify nowadays, but I think Magento Open Source is still really relevant. If you look at the stats, I took these from Build With. Magento Open Source still has about 10% market share. And that means that there are still a lot of merchants depending on Magento. They have a livelihood depending on that. They have their business running on that, and they're making money out of the platform. And there are also still many developers in the community working on it as well. So we also know that the ecosystem changed, right? Right after the Adobe acquisition of Magento in 2018, Adobe started rebranding Magento Enterprise or Magento Commerce back in the day to Adobe Commerce. And the Magento Open Source name gradually disappeared from the marketing strategy and is mentioned less and less, unfortunately. Up until the point where Adobe decided that the Magento Open Source website was no longer viable, and they changed it to a redirect into to the Adobe site. There's still a link there, but it's really tucked away in the menu to Magento Open Source. We also noticed this with the documentation. We noticed that the documentation gradually moved from docs.magento.com or devdocs.magento.com to the Adobe Experience League. The positioning and branding was more and more focused around Adobe Commerce, and mentions of Magento Open Source and references steadily diminished from the documentation. And this created really confusing situations for merchants as well as developers when they tried to find information about the Magento Open Source product. One good example about this, I found this one on Reddit. A developer of 8 years, and this guy or girl, I don't know, was really confused about the documentation. Couldn't find where it is. It's like, well, is there more than this? I'm referred to the Adobe website. Well, my task is to work on the Magento 2 platform, so help. Then the Magento Association comes in. So there's an agreement in place between Adobe and the Magento Association. Typically it's about trademarks so that the association can license the Meet Magento events worldwide. But there's also an item in there that the association is in charge of the marketing of Magento Open Source. However, it's not defined how, what, where, or whatsoever. So that's kind of open to discussion. And on the board level, we have Ritesh from Adobe there. We are talking about it and how to execute on that line item in the contract, and ask them quite a few questions where he takes them back within Adobe, and we are following up and we're waiting, but nobody within Adobe is signing off on a particular item. For instance, we tried to get something like Magento.com being redirected or Magento.org. Which didn't materialize. So at the end of the day, at the board level, we decided to take things in a different approach. Instead of waiting for Adobe to sign off on things, we're just gonna get started. And when there's an issue with the things we're doing, which are not outlined in the contract, then we can always fallback, and change course. So we did this first in 2024 with the launch of the new marketing website for Magento Open Source, which I spearheaded out of the Magento Association. We really felt that merchants were left behind. There was no single point of information anymore, where merchants could find the features of the platform, etc. So we introduced this site back in 2024 and launched it at Meet Magento UK that year. So now we're coming a little bit into the documentation part, because this year, or last year, I must say, was my last year as a board member of the association. I've been there on 7 years. Some other people, Sergey, who's in the audience here, took over the role. I was off-boarded, but I wanted to do something final in that board year to make a lasting impression. So we also had a different approach with Slava being the president, that we defined certain tasks. Every board member had tasks assigned to them and was able to execute on those tasks. For me, after the marketing website launch, it was logical to start with documentation because it was still a gap in the information for merchants as well as developers. So this is us in the first board meeting last year. We had all the ideas on the board, and everybody picked some topics. And I picked the documentation topic together with VJ. All right, so then I got started with documentation and was like, well, I'm definitely not going to do this assignment on my own. So let's start a committee around it, because I need more people in order to get this thing up and running. Me and VJ announced this on LinkedIn, asking for people to be on this committee. We received around 20 different submissions. We reviewed them all. We selected quite a few members with diverse backgrounds. So either people who could review or write documentation, but also like front end, and someone for the back end part of it. So we finally landed upon this documentation committee, which were really all really helpful the past year in order to create a new open source documentation site. So we have Anand from India. Carl, as you can see, he is open to work. So if you need a front end or a Magento developer guy, he's in the UK, is still available. David, who was already working with Magento OS documentation, so his technical expertise came handy into this committee. Chris was on board a little bit later. I will talk a bit about it in the next couple of sheets, because we really ran into an issue with design really fast. So Chris was the designer. Nidhi from India, also content creation, VJ, and myself. We started to do weekly meetings with this committee, and first started with the discovery phase. We did find the old documentation still somewhere on GitHub. It's still out there. We looked at other open source documentation setup and tools, and considered different kinds of options like MKDocs or Laravel-based documentation, and the thing that David already created. Some boundaries that we set there was that it should be easy to maintain and the community should be able to contribute, because with the Adobe documentation that's kind of hard. We really wanted to go back to the original situation where everybody could just click edit on GitHub, create a pull request, and rewrite some part of the documentation or improve it or take out a typo. So we quite discussed reusing the old documentation, which would be really helpful because it was already there, would create a fast start, right, with all the items still there. However, we quickly realized that that was not the way to go. First of all, there would be a risk of relevance, like is it still, it's outdated, so what are we going to publish? And we also noticed that the structure of the old merchant documentation of Magento was more menu focused. So if a merchant was looking for someone, they needed to already know where they would find that option in the Magento backend in order to find the right content. And we decided to take a different approach where we would write guides that are more action-focused. So, for instance, a guide to publish a product, because that's a real-world situation that a merchant has. And with that guide, we can help them to publish the product on their Magento store. Next up was the Git repository. We looked also at the old Magento repo, where the content and the actual structure of the site was in the same repo, which made it a bit confusing. So we decided to do two repositories. One just for the content, where it's created out of Markdown files, really easy. And the other one is the website repository containing the actual code, the build pipeline, etc. All right, like I mentioned, we already quickly came into the issue that we needed a design. So that's where Chris came on board. Chris was already doing the Meet Magento UK designs, and he was able to help us out with creating a new design for the open source documentation site. When we started to create the requirements for that, we quickly landed into a discussion more about the Magento brand as a whole, or the Magento Open Source brand as a whole. But this committee was just focused on the documentation, so I needed to narrow it down again in order to make the execution of this as fast as possible. However, Chris is working with other committees to also design other things for the Magento Association. So this is what he came up with. Landing page. We took inspiration from other documentation platforms, Slack, Laravel, etc. We tried to get the right vibe going on as well. Chris came up with different colors. For the merchant, it's of course Magento orange. Second color, the yellow one. For the developer documentation, it's going to be more purple, so there's a visual separation between the two. Here, you see those categories for the merchant. You see that all those items are actionable items, like creating your first product, how to set up your payment processing, etc. And then, well, we got the design, we have the structure in place, let's get the content, right? So, we quickly realized that we had limited capacity, so AI would be helpful here, especially with the experience that David already had in creating AI-generated documentation. However, we first noticed that the early results were really not good. It was hallucinating features, menu items, etc. So we eventually came up with a multi-agent approach where one agent would create the documentation. It would feed that to another agent, reviewing the documentation, trying to execute those steps, and giving it a reliability score. And it kept going into that loop until the score was above a certain point. So it started to improve itself every time, and then we came with documentation which was actually pretty good, and all those guides are in the same format. So this is what the AI agent console looks like. First of all, we can do a full workflow, but it can also scan and analyze existing documentation, and based on what's out there, it can also suggest topics that we need to write. So it's got the proposed articles, Then we have the step to generate the content, and we can validate the quality of the content as well. So what does that look like? So here we have a guide on how to set up your payment processing. It also always starts with an overview, the read time, as well as the knowledge base, or the knowledge level that you need to have. In this case, it's an advanced tutorial. The merchants will always know what he will learn at the end of the tutorial and what success criteria are. And before you start this particular guide, it will say what you need in advance in order to create it, to make this guide successful. So in this case, well, you need admin access, kind of obvious. Store configuration, inventory needs to be set up. You need to be on Magento 2.4, etc. So what's next? Well, merchant documentation, we have about 40-50 guides right now. So that's an achievement that we made. However, dev docs are still missing. We're currently working on that. The goal was to finish that by Meet Magento India last week. Unfortunately, we didn't make it. So this is still work in progress. We're getting there. It's going to be 2 levels basically. First would be to explain the architectural overview, basic concepts of Magento, layout, XML, blocks, etc. The other part we're looking at is a full API reference, so that all the endpoints are documented. Other thing, still, merchant documentation, 50 guides is pretty good, but there are still gaps there, so we can expand on those as well. So now the question is, how are you able to contribute? You can make small changes, like I mentioned. Every page has a edit on GitHub link. So if you see an issue, a mistake, typo, etc., please hit that button, create the PR, and help us out. Next, if you have a little bit more time, try to improve a guide. Verify that the steps are still correct, or maybe it's outdated or unclear. Hopefully somebody can pick something up. And if you're really into it, create a new content. And there's also a starting point, because we currently have an issue open on GitHub about the email configuration. The AI didn't generate a really good document for that. So if somebody wants to improve that, it would be really helpful. And you can do that on GitHub, which would be the document repo. The second link, the first one is the actual documentation website. And the third one is if you want to clone the website itself and try to work with it locally, you can do so and improve it as well. Now the question is, how can we improve the Magento open source documentation further? And maybe people have questions. Sure. Can you talk a little bit more about Good question. So currently we do not have anyone from the community adding yet, so that's the question for the audience here to just start doing that. So what we did, the AI generated documents or guides, and we did check them before publishing, but some fell through the cracks as well, to be honest. So.
Is there hello? Sorry. Is there a Slack channel where people can engage with you, maybe people who aren't document experts, and maybe how they can get started other than just, I don't know, not described experts, if you will. They're kind of new to everything.
Yeah, I'm on the Magento Association Slack, of course, so you can hit me up there, or on my LinkedIn. You've already found me, so that's quite easy. Yeah, I will help to get you started.
Any more questions? Yeah.
No worries. Good one. We chose to do the merchant documentation first because the developers in this community kind of know where the difference between Adobe Commerce and Magento Open Source, whereas those merchants, from my point of view, could get really confused right now, especially if you look at the merchant documentation of Adobe Commerce. It's changing and there's no obvious distinction anymore between the the Adobe Commerce features and the Magento Open Source features, so they can easily get stuck there. So that's why we opted to do the merchant documentation first, because we felt that there was more value there than doing the dev docs. Sander. Yeah, so for the dev doc, it's going to be a little bit of a different approach. Not really the task-based approach that we did for merchants, but more explaining the concepts about config.xml, for instance, or system.xml, etc., the blocks. Yeah, we discussed that, and that kind of made sense to make that distinction between merchants and developers. Yeah, you can use the agent that we're using and try to recreate the documentation. You need two API keys, which is the ChatGPT key as well as the Anthropic Claude key. So we're using two different AI tools as well in order to generate those guides. You're welcome. Well, Sander, you're next. Thank you.